much, Theo, for doing this with us. It's really, really brilliant to be having all these conversations with you, and for the book that you've just released, reading that, and hopefully sharing that with our students really very soon. So I think the first thing to do is just to do some introductions. So I'll probably go first. So I'm Laura Hamblin. I am the course leader at the University of East London on the BSc in Forensic Psychology. So I lecture in psychology. I'm also a researcher on child abuse and beliefs around witchcraft and spirit possession and the contextual analysis of those cases. So obviously we're really, really pleased, Theo, to have you hopefully involved in the course with us here at UEL. And I'd really love for you to just share with us now your expertise. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your organisation.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, and thank you for chairing the seminar. As you know, it's part of the RJ webinar series that we have, which aim to basically increase awareness around restorative justice, make it more accessible to people. Because one thing that keeps coming up is that we all talk about restorative justice, but not too many people know about restorative justice, the good and the bad, the possibilities, but also the challenges that restorative justice has, as a theory, but also as a practice. So it was a pleasure, to have the lecture just a few weeks ago at UEL, and talk about power, race, and restorative justice, which is the book that I was working on, for the last 20 years. So it is a special occasion. It was a special occasion for me, and thanks for chairing this event. I won't talk a lot about myself, because people who probably have watched the webinars know who I am already. There's also another webinar that I did with Pavan Dhaliwal on the same topic, which is again on race and power. It will come up on the screen as a follow-up if that hasn't been watched already by the students or the viewers of this webinar. But in terms of what I do, in addition to me being a visiting professor at UL and the psychology department, do we say department or school? School of Psychology?
Yeah, School of Psychology. I can't even speak. School of Psychology, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's School of Psychology. I run an organisation, an NGO that is called Restorative Justice for All International Institute. And my vision 10 years ago, when I set it up, is to actually do what it says on the team: restorative justice for all. And that means being accessible to all, and being available as an option, but not dictate restorative justice, and whether you're a victim, an offender, or just a member of the public. Because as we will cover soon, restorative justice is not just about crime and prevention, it's about how we live our lives. But it is an option, and it should be an option and not forced onto people. Because if you do that, then you take away one of the most important principles of restorative justice, which is that of voluntariness. I won't say anything else in relation to myself and what I'm doing. There'll be a lot of information on the video and in the links. Crack on with your questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Theo, and again, huge congratulations on the professorship with UEL. We're really, really pleased to have you, and amazingly, the book that you've released recently, I think it's going to be a really valuable resource for so many people, including our students. So thanks again for that, and well done. Okay, so moving on to the questions. Your book promises to awaken us in realising our true existence. How do you achieve this?
Yeah, so I think the only way to describe that, because any book has, especially a book that is written for academic purposes, has certain kind of literature ambitions, to bridge a gap in the literature, to support, whether it's a reading list or whatever it is. I think this book for me was more than that, and that's why it has a very personal tone, and I use first language to speak about things that I'm writing in the book. And as I said, it was the outcome of 20 years of work, and 20 years in the equality field and the human rights field, the criminal justice field. And how it aims to awaken people. And when I say awakening, I don't mean spiritual awakening, because that can be confused. of moral awakening. I'm talking about intellectual awakening. And the way I can describe it is if I use what I call the table and justice analogy. And it's something that I had to experience myself. And for example, if you close your eyes and you think of a table, the image that will come into your kind of brain will be something with a top and 4 legs, right? Now the opposite, if you put like in Google, top and 4 legs, it will give you images of a table, right? Around. Now, in a similar way, if you think of justice and you close your eyes, most likely what you will see is either the goddess Themida holding the sword and the scales of justice, being blindfolded, or people holding hands, people around in a group, something like that. And again, if you put that word justice in Google, the first thing we'll give you as an image is Themis, is the goddess. Now, that kind of made me think, so why then, when we speak of justice and criminal justice, the first thing that we think about is not actually what this test has resulted in, but really we think of punishment, of prisons, of ministries of justice and things like that. When something bad happens, we want to enforce this wish of putting people behind prisons and see punishment being exercised. We don't instantly say, okay, so this thing happened, this crime is taking place, and visualize, you know, this higher value of justice, which is represented through a goddess for the Greeks, and so on, right?
Yeah.
And Foucault said it in 91 in what he said, power and control, and this is kind of part of the intellectual awakening that I'm referring to. And he said, you know, we are being controlled, and our sense of justice and our expectations are being controlled, which is why we want prisons, we want punishment in that form, and not in a higher virtue existence kind of way, because we must be controlled. Because he said, by controlling our sense of justice, our expectations can be directed, okay, and subsequently the reality can be manipulated. And this intellectual awakening comes from, because if the reality is being manipulated silently, then unless we're awakened, we're not going to be able to address this, right? Why is this manipulation? So without this manipulation, there can be a change, and change is a threat to status quo that leads to power abuse and inequality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chisholm said it in a different way around race, and she said racism is so universal in this country, she was referring to the US, so widespread and deep-seated that it is invisible because it is so normal. So we'll normalize it, we'll normalize racism. Malcolm X said something similar. He said, I believe that if you give people a thorough understanding of what confronts them and the basic causes that produce it, they'll create their own program. And when there is people who create programs, then you get action, and then action leads to change. So the only way to control that is by creating this cloud, by creating this control sense of what justice is, so that we don't create programs and we don't resist. Because where there's resistance, there is change. So as I said in this book, which is not about conspiracy theories, and I know that sounds a little bit crazy, oh my God, what theory are you doing? You know, you've been a researcher all your life, looking at evidences, why are you talking about this kind of, you know, controlled sense of justice and images of justice? Because I had to go through this awakening myself. I had to watch myself over what I was doing in the race equality movement, in the restorative justice movement. And that was always something that was bothering me. It was always there, you know, despite the programs, the books, or whatever I was writing and doing. That was this lingering feeling of something was wrong. And this is what I came to realize, that through evidence, which I collected and put in this book, to show that it is a very controlled way of manipulating the reality, and then as a result not to resist against that reality. And through that, we gradually and consensually accepted new forms of slavery. So we're going to talk about this, I'm assuming, soon. So whereas had, more visible forms of slavery in the past, this is a new form of slavery that we ourselves have accepted gradually and silently.
My next question for you, Theo, really is about the power, race and privilege that you've talked about in your book, and that's been debated quite significantly in literature already. What is it that's new about your debate?
Yeah, and I think that's the key question, and the key word is what is new, because critical race theory has raised all these issues around race, and what I'm trying to achieve with this statement in the book is to help us move away from the silo thinking when it comes to race equality or any equality or inequality, and being able to put them in the context of power and power abuse, because I think that is the overarching issue and problem when it comes to inequalities and poverty. So if we expect, this is a quote from the book, and said, if we all experience the world in the same way, and if we were given the same choices and opportunities, then no group could claim that they are more oppressed than others, and racial differences will be seen for what they are, which are human divisive constructs. And I know that might upset certain people, especially those who have worked really hard in the race equality movement, to say, how can you say that? And I understand the concerns, which are concerns that I also experienced when I was involved in the passing of the race equality bill at the time, the single equality bill. We were discussing about bringing all equality strands under one roof for the Single Equality Act, and obviously human rights that look at inequalities in a human rights holistic way. And it's not about not acknowledging the work that each equality strand has done. It's not about acknowledging our characteristics around race or gender or whatever it is, but it's about looking at the person in a holistic way. And this statement really says that these racial differences, the protective mechanisms around them, are really human divisive constructs that don't exist. But we are trained, conditioned to look at these things, but they don't really exist. It doesn't, and it shouldn't matter. In a nice world, they shouldn't matter. So I use race in its analytical and sociological context, and I'll move away from the kind of biological or sociological interpretations, and I want to put an emphasis on the process of power abuse that then racializes all groups independently of their race, color, background, culture, you name it. And that is the difficult conversation that we need to have. This is part of this. That's why the title, the dialogue we will not have, is one of those dialogues that we will not have. There's other dialogues in the book that I'm also encouraging people to have, including the restorative justice movement dialogue that they're not having about their own power abuse. But just focusing on this dialogue about race, I suppose it could be summarized in kind of three realizations around race and power and privilege. And the first one was what I say, what I call that slavery still exists, and what I said in a new form. And whereas in the past, slavery was something that was accepted, it was visible, you would buy a slave, you would own the slave, there was a long-term relationship, there was very little financial returns, low profits, and a shortage of potential slaves. This new form of slavery that I'm talking about is independent of race. It is silent. It has very high profits. There is surplus of potential slaves. Take, for example, the migrant situation, how those in power, independently of how much that power is, whether you are running an organization or you are, in government or whatever it is, how we use this capital that we don't call slaves, but it is a cheap capital, how much it is out there in terms of availability, how silent that usage of that capital is done, and to what extent, and how quickly we can move on disposing those slaves. Whereas in the past, you had that slave under your responsibility, whereas now it is very quick. So that form of slavery obviously is not overt, it's silent, and yet we are allowing it. And it's becoming bigger and bigger and bigger with the refugee situation, with the migrant situation in Europe, and how we use that narrative, right? And again, that goes back to, you know, this awakening, this intellectual awakening, and what is your role as an educator, for example, to stop this, because you are silently agreeing to this silent form of slavery. You might even be benefiting from it, and you don't conceptualize it, you don't watch yourself doing it. And I'm not talking about Laura, I'm talking about anyone who is watching this webinar, because I had to ask myself that, and how I behave as somebody who's running an organization, as an employer, when it comes to these forms of slavery, right? And obviously no one who is subject to this, and I'm a migrant myself, no one would accept if somebody comes and tells them that, hey, you are a silent new slave. And me saying, oh, actually, you're right. Let's say, how dare you calling me a slave? That's probably going to be my first reaction, which then creates resistance, because if you don't accept that, then you're not going to claim your rights. You're not going to go and say, hang on a minute, why am I getting paid this when this person's getting paid that? The second realization, I mentioned those three of them, is what I call disadvantaged thinking. And if you ask any of your psychology students, you know, what is the most important thing to succeed and achieve in life, is first to have to believe in yourself, to have self-confidence. You know, if you believe in yourself, it doesn't matter how many volunteering programs and internships and funding schemes and all this sort of thing that you can throw to a young person and just say, now you can go and achieve everything you want in life. You know, we even created this term needs, and fund programs for needs, you know, young people who might not be in education, training, whatever it stands for. But, you know, when I was in that position, if somebody was calling me a need young person and giving me a job for 6 months, or a volunteering placement, or some sort of funding for a few months, I might just take it, but it wouldn't make any huge difference to my life, right? But what did make a difference, and I found myself doing things that really made, you know, a long time change in my life, such as like going to law school or, you know, getting a job, was when they said, you know what, Theo, I believe in you, and I can see a talent that you have, and I'm going to support that talent and nurture that talent.
Absolutely.
When do we do that, especially when it comes to young offenders? We try to control the risk. So we would say, oh, you know, you have a drug issue, or you have, you know, alcohol addiction issue, or you have a family history issue. So let's try and control that. Let's put you in a program that will control that. We don't say, oh, hang on, John, you're good in, I don't know, football or writing or designing. Let's look into that and encourage that, right? Yep, so what is disadvantage thinking? Is not helping us to develop our talents. It is about making us feel, oh, hang on a minute, I'm not driving that car, I'm not wearing that uniform, I don't sound in a certain way, so there is no way I'm going to succeed in life. And that is not just about whether you are, you know, from a certain race background, or whether you are whatever, right? It is that disadvantage thinking that is created, again, for this sense of power and control. Because if you can control that, the ambitions of people, then the status quo will remain, and that status quo serves a purpose, okay? And it's to do, again, what I said before with race. It impacts, yes, those groups are part of this as well, but it's not exclusionary. It's inclusive, actually, in terms of who we are as, you know, individuals who have so many different characteristics that fall within that, right? And the final realization in relation to power, race, and privilege and all that is what I call the grouping of victimization. And again, there is a purpose for this. So what I say grouping is that we ended up in the last 20 years when we as legislators, policymakers, educators are trying to fight, let's say, race inequality or gender inequality or disability or whatever it is, to come into groups and create NGOs, campaigns. So it will be the Race Equality Movement, then be Race Equality Act, the gender movement, and so on. So those groupings of victimization, let's say I'm a woman, I'm a black person, then create their own structures for protection, right? But those structures of protection end up being in competition often. So whether it's a funding stream, they're saying, oh, do you know what? Why is my grouping not getting funding for this? Or why is, you know, we have a Race Equality Act, but not something around, I don't know, LGBT, which actually until, you know, the very late 90s, it was, you know, allowed, and it wasn't, you know, in school, you couldn't say anything about, you know, orientation. And these groupings of victimization in terms of focusing on addressing the actual issue, which is the power abuse, they're focusing on competing against each other. And this competition distracts energy, distracts time, distracts what the work should be all about, right? It puts them in competition. It puts them, it's like when you have different channels on TV, you know, they're all competing against each other. And that wastes, it's a lot of waste in terms of energy or where it should be going, which is to address the power abuse, right? Racializes us all, as I said. But, you know, obviously, you know, the book goes into a lot more detail, and this is just a very, you know, it's a very short summary of, you know, where I'm coming from when it comes to power, race and privilege. And it is literally just helping to move things forward in terms of the debate, because I think just continuing to do the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, as Einstein said, it's just madness. And we've got to look at our own selves and how we are behaving within our movement, within our sector, whatever that is, to see what we can do differently. And that's what I'm trying to achieve with this debate that we need to have.
Okay, thank you. So let me ask you, you've spoken about this intellectual awakening, you've spoken about the 3 realizations, and also, you know, you've just acknowledged this to some extent, but what do you aim to achieve through this new monograph?
Yeah, so this monograph, it has like 4 different main concepts, and that is power, race, justice, and restorative justice, and it's structured in a way that the first part kind of challenges those concepts.
Yeah.
Challenge them in the way that they appear in our current practices, in our current literature. The second part deconstructs them, and because we have challenged them in the first part and said this is what we are experiencing today, and this is you know how it should be, deconstructs them. And then in the final part, it is about the debate on how we move things forward.
Yeah.
Now, putting all that together, I would say, I would summarize that my main objective, and this is why I don't want people to think of this book as just an academic reference book, is more of I want them, I know it's not an easy read, you know, certain sections, you know, there has academic references and all these sort of things. But my ultimate objective is to actually create hope. It's all around hope, right? Because if there is what we're experiencing today, we had COVID, right? We have the financial crisis. It's just this growing sense of despair. What I was talking about, this disadvantage thinking, and any young person who is watching this, or you don't even need to be young, any person who's watching this or is part of a psychology department, school, or, you know, a degree, you know, they're feeling this kind of despair, defeatism, like we are defeated already. You know, we're dealing with, you know, probably financial consequences as severe as those of the Second World War, right? You know, there's no jobs, you know, we are in deficit, we came out of Europe, we don't know, you know, all this kind of lingering feelings of we don't know where we're going with this, right? And we have despair, and that despair, this defeatism, this lack of hope, again, as I said before, is not by coincidence. It is there for a reason, because we need to be controlled so that there is no resistance. This is a tale from Aboriginals And it was the little hummingbird that saw the fire, and the little hummingbird was taking one drop of water every time and flying back and forth, and dropping the drop of water onto the fire, obviously with the risk of getting burned, right? And the animals saw the little hummingbird going back and forth, and said, "What are you doing, little hummingbird?" And it said, "Well, I'm doing, trying to get the fire." It's like, "But you're going to burn, there's not much I can do," like the wolf said, or the big bear said, "I'm going to burn if I try that." And then, the hummingbird ignored them and went back and forth, continues throwing the one drop, in the hope that the fire would, stop. And they said, "Well," one of the animals just screamed, "It's like, you've got to stop, you're going to burn. What are you doing?" And then just literally the little hummingbird said, "I'm doing what I can." And this is what it summarizes down to, because if every little hummingbird drops one drop, and more hummingbirds come to the fire and drop more drops of water, then all those drops become rivers, and the rivers wash out whatever we need to wash out. So every little contribution that we're making as educators, as justice people, as lawyers, as whatever it is that you're doing, as parents, that's the most important role. When you have children and they'll become the new hummingbirds in our lives and in our, in the future. Then if we believe in that there is that hope, that each individual action counts, then that's the biggest message and the biggest contribution that I can demonstrate through evidence and through this book, that it will make a difference. You just need to believe and shake off this defeatism and lack of hope that is being gradually developed and we are accepting.
Such a beautiful and powerful parable, and it's something that I think from your inaugural lecture I've kept with me when I think about your book. So thanks for sharing that again. It's brilliant. So Theo, your work has obviously inspired and aims to continue inspiring students to study and integrate restorative justice across varied professional contexts. Can I ask you, what are the key principles or practices that forensic psychology students in particular must grasp most of all?
Yeah, so I think first of all, because restorative justice kind of, it's been around for some time now, since the 70s. There's more writings on restorative justice than probably any other policy in the criminal justice field. So I think the first thing to understand is, where restorative justice comes from, and is not a new concept, is actually the way that we used to, Aboriginals spoke about it, but in ancient Athens, Aristotle wrote about restorative justice. It was the most natural and organic way of using to address and prevent conflict at all levels, not just within the kind of crime field, which, this word crime and the laws around crime were created only after the Middle Ages, when the kingdoms were created and the kings created laws to structurally and top down, prevent and control crime. But restorative justice was the organic and natural way of dealing with conflicts at all levels, within families, within friends, within, whatever, the communities. So the first thing that I would say to anyone who's interested in restorative justice is look at the history of restorative justice, because that will resonate a lot with you, and it will put also in context what you're doing in life. When you have your own conflicts with your parents, with your friends, with whatever, with your teachers. And once you understand that, the history, then I would ask to look at the theories and philosophy of restorative justice, which not too many people even know exists. We all talk about what restorative justice can do through mediation and conferencing, and what it can do about different types of crime, but very little knowledge is out there in terms of what is the foundations of restorative justice, what are the theoretical underpinnings of restorative justice, which is also what I'm trying to challenge with this book. Because, when you say about punishment, for example, and we say about just desserts, which is one of the most, ancient, eye for an eye, right? The Bible said it, kind of the most ancient, justifications of punishment, then how does restorative justice justify its own practices? So I'm asking those questions of justification, which are not just theoretical questions, they're very moral and important questions to ask if you're going to get involved in implementing restorative justice, right? How do I justify imposing restorative justice, which can be very demanding emotionally and psychologically? So students who are getting trained to become the new forensic psychologists without understanding the philosophical implications, the justifications of that practice, that will involve a lot of psychological triggers, trauma, and all sorts of mental health situations, then it will be impossible to practice it. And now, when that is done, then you move on to the more kind of practical implementation of restorative justice, which comes in all sorts of shapes and forms. I mentioned practices already about mediation, conferencing, circles is a very important practice, and understanding the dynamics around those. And in fact, they will see, any psychology student will see that there is a lot of similarities with therapy groups, so there's very fine line between a group therapy and a circle. How you perform those practices, what support you give, and how you put the ground rules for those practices so that they are safe, they lead to certain outcomes, and there is respect of the process of circle. So in the same way you would teach them about group therapy, what are the outcomes, what do you need to have in place, what are the agreements, what are you aiming to achieve? In the same fashion, you will have the same structure and learning around circles, for example. And what is the difference between the two?
But I think there's going to be a really palpable passion around the dynamics of power and race. And I think really what I want to ask you is, what do you feel that our students on the BSc in forensic psychology are going to gain specifically from your involvement in their teaching that they won't necessarily gain elsewhere? And also, how is that then going to translate to the workplace for them?
Yeah, and then maybe this, can be broadened. I mean, it's not just, the UEL students, it's kind of anyone who wants to be a radical. And radical, we tend to attach it to something that is bad. It's just when radicalization is attached to violence that becomes bad. Radicalization is a very good thing in my view. And look at the colonies, for example, in the British Empire, they wouldn't be freed if there wasn't some sort of radicalized action. And usually that radicalized action is done by young people or people who believe in it, something can be changed. And I want to create radicals with my teaching, with my book, with the work that I do, radicals that can make a better future for themselves and their children and the future generations. How do you become a radical? Well, first of all, by learning to watch yourself and become the watcher of yourself. And arts academics were very, like when you work for any top-down structural institution, whether it's a university or the criminal justice system, a government department, and I'm talking this from my own experience, having been in the Ministry of Justice, in universities, and so on, we are limited in what we can say or do to create radicals. And I think I have, the luxury and the freedom to be controversial sometimes and speak my mind, with hopefully the responsibility and the evidence that is needed to create those radical movements that I think our young people and our world really needs right now. So it's not just about, reading another book on restorative justice or more theories around it and, me talking for 4 hours about, the theory of restorative justice. Is really how that will connect with your own ambitions. Why did you become a student in the first place? Why are you studying in this university? Why are you watching this? Is it just, to get a degree because your parents sent you there? Is this disadvantaged thinking, this lingering feeling of I have to do something with myself that you're there for, or because you believe in something bigger about, the world and yourself, and you have this ambition about yourself? And how does that connect with the empowerment that we're talking about and the awakening that needs to take place to then create this hope that will then create the little hummingbirds that all together will change the world?
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for today, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you yet again.
No, it was an absolute pleasure, and as always, I think it makes me think now and kind of probably prepare the future webinars, because I was very intrigued about your own research background of child abuse.
Yeah.
And there is a huge theme under restorative justice and child abuse, especially cases that took place in institutions such as the church, the Catholic Church, for example, and any other kind of faith institutions. And so I would be very interested to host a different webinar with me then asking the questions on child abuse.
Absolutely.
Have that debate, and I was very interested. I mean, it's not my field of expertise, but witchcraft, I think that's something else that people might be interested in. So with the caveat of you agreeing to have this webinar, I would love you to be in the future in one of the webinars covering these topics, if that's something that you'd be interested in.
Absolutely, yes, of course. Thank you. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Laura.